So welcome. I'm Spinoza Quinnell, and I'm with Lobo, and we have delightful Doowangle and JJ. They've been helping us with our work that we're going to share today about professional development. And if you notice, our title is called Soul of the Charioteer in Virtual Orbit Around Mars, and we kind of play on the allegory that Plato offered through Socrates about this notion that our lives can be like driving a chariot, and it's difficult at times as you go through your life, trying to do the right things in all the right ways that we can think that we should be doing. And so Plato often thought about it as like trying to control two horses. You know, one horse has high ideals about how to make the right decisions, and the other horse is always seems like it's pulling in opposite directions. And so we just found it really intriguing to see what we could do to take the current research in professional identity and take some of Carol Dwight's work on the growth of mindsets for development in your lifespan, and combine that in a really interesting way. And I'm going to ask leadership to go to the next slide.
I sure will, Andy, but let me finish introducing our team. You look at the text chat there for a moment. JJ Drinkwater's with us, the librarian of Calongne for me. And then we have, of course, delightful Doowangle. We're all parts of the Harmony Society. And if you can't hear me, by the way, let me know in the text chat, because I am looking at it with a feverish intensity. Hey, thanks, Buffy. Okay, Andy, here's the next slide.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the things that we're doing came out of a really fascinating discussion at MIT a few years ago. We were talking about complexity, and in the times that we live in, it's often very difficult to know how to navigate when you don't know the solutions to things, and you have to sort of weigh the pros and cons and cost benefits. This is a fairly common dilemma faces professionals at very high levels of their practice. But whether you're in medicine or law, divinity, or other areas of the professions, it's not just about how much you know or the level of your expertise and the proficiencies of what you do with your skill sets, but it's also very, very interestingly connected to your moral and ethical reasoning. So people across MIT and Harvard and Columbia, they've been researching this fascinating interrelationship between cognitive abilities and moral ethical reasoning abilities. They intertwine as you go deeper into your professional practice. So as you see in our visual here, it's Plato's allegory of the chariot. We sort of see, an effort with professional development to try to help guide professionals to practice, good, wise choices with their ethical decisions. We know that in professions we often have expectations that we're going to contribute to the overall good and common good of society in which we participate in. And the behaviors that we engage in, we want our behaviors to be virtuous, to try to do the right things in the right ways for the right reasons. Next visual set. So we worked with the Center for Creative Leadership, and they gave us a really interesting way of thinking about the work that we're doing. And over the years, the Center for Creative Leadership has come up with a model that they've helped us to employ in our work related to this concept of horizontal and vertical development. What's fascinating, in the times that we live in, there is a lot of emphasis on competencies, people to acquire certain levels of proficiencies, skill sets, and so forth, but very little discussion around, what do you do to grow in those competencies over time? So the competencies, some baseline is horizontal growth that we all readily relate to, and then there's this vertical part of our growth where, in practice, as we exercise ways to deal with complexity and the kinds of ethical dilemmas that we can expect in our practice, what does it mean to grow continuously in your practice throughout your lifespan of service? So they kind of compare it to these images of, the filling water into your cup, right? Horizontal growth is you're filling the cup up, and vertical growth is you're expanding the size of your cup. Next visual, Lear, if you don't mind. Oh, thank you. So what you see here is research from Columbia University related to Perry's work at Harvard for several years, almost 30, I could say 40 years at Harvard, and Columbia University under Lee Kneffenkamp picked it up. She was a student of Perry's. And what they have found is this really fascinating trajectory of growth that as you engage in your professional practice, people that are really highly intelligent and proficient, get at levels 3 in their practice where they're very competent, they're independent, very self-directed. But what Harvard and Columbia recognize is that it takes a little special effort to go to those higher levels in your practice, your levels 4 and 5. And the characteristics of levels 4 and 5 seem to me to be so relevant for the times that we live in today. They deal with this notion of interdependency in your practice. Like if you're on a medical care team, you're often expected to practice as a team member in a medical setting, and that's also true in all the other professions. So increasingly, as our skills get so interdependent in the execution of those skills for good results, it requires a whole different types of sets of skills and understanding and perspectives that don't just come from being an independent thinker. And so one of our colleagues, delightful, Dr. Barbara Truman, she did her dissertation in a very fascinating area of transdisciplinary, where in a lot of our applications, there's a knowledge that transcends, as it were, any particular specific domain. And you learn a common language, you begin to understand how to effectively translate and interpret different areas of expertise, and collectively you get to deeper insights that you wouldn't otherwise get from your independence of what you do as a professional. You have some thoughts, Barbara or JJ, on this kind of level of work that we're doing at levels 4 and 5? So on this visual, what we've been trying to do is create an environment that supports this kind of professional growth I've just outlined. And so it's a hybrid environment where we're taking advantage of the benefits of immersive virtual spaces, much like what you see here in Second Life. And we're in an open source platform with our work, but the same benefits of what you can do in these really fascinating immersive 3D spaces is pretty extraordinary. But so that's a key part of our work. We also support the self-paced kinds of things you can do with the learning management system and a learning commons environment where you can get with others and share among your colleagues and professionals. And we have assessment devices that help for a person to self-reflect and think about where they're at in their growth in their professions. And then we have these simulations. And one particularly today we're going to spend some time on that has grown out of our work over several years is the model expeditions. But collectively, across all these components of our what we call the growth environment, we give people multiple ways to enter into opportunities to become aware of what these higher levels of professional growth could entail for them. So they have a chance to explore and try out some of these perspectives and skills associated with levels 4 and 5. Anything, Lear, or you'd like to share or delightful?
Well, actually, the next slide's really what the one that makes the world come to life for me. Delightful, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Delightful says, we've been studying Gary Klein's work on where insights come from and how to increase frequency. So we're weaving in quite a few thinkers and quite a bit of research over the last 40 years or longer. And we're really trying to understand it and nurture things like values-based leadership, our moral compass, our ethics. I know that may sound, like soft skills, right? And yet we feel that they're so important to everything we do, right? It's not just doing 3D graphics and creating simulations and creating games and jumping into them and going through the mechanics of a learning activity or other. It's really thinking about how do these things feed our spirit, drive our decisions, help us to grow in our profession, and also to think about what's our legacy long after we leave this place. What are we accomplishing that matters? And please feel welcome to type in the text chat or to give us your thoughts. And if you have any connections with what we're working on here, it may sound a little different, but Andy's a very deep thinker, and we all are, and we're very interested in why do we do what we do, and what do we learn from it that's intrinsically, critical and vital to our understanding. And we're not just thinking on the surface benefits, the learning objectives, the outcomes, that kind of thing. This system is learning from the people who participate in it. So it's not just our development, it's also our system's development. And the next slide starts to show you a little bit about that. Let me go ahead and put it up there. So Andy, I'll warm us up and then I'll pull you back into it. So you see this tree over here. Let me cue up my handy dandy little script. And if anyone needs a copy of my script, just let me know. Here we see this tree, and I love the tree of contemplative mind. And if there's more to the tree now, Andy, let me know. But we think about all the ways in which we live a life of purpose and a life of service, and also our reasons for what we do and why these things matter. Andy, you go ahead and step on in, and then I'll jump in after you.
Well, where this comes from, this is a part of the Columbia University research on the types of dispositions that people can grow into over time. So if you look at the different colors that we have of the leaves on the tree, we start out with the foundational competencies associated with being a really capable professional, and usually with any professional development, you have a guild process where you're brought in and you're expected to have mentors, and you go on medical rounds for instance, and learn about the practice of medicine. So you take your medical knowledge from the classroom and you have to learn how to apply it in real life studies. So you got to be team players. You got to understand what it means to be reliant on authority, seek direction when you're unsure of something. So you're still in that part where you're gaining proficiency. and you want to align well with others, so that you appreciate the contributions of other people that are part of your professional team. And then as you are expected to grow over the next several years, as I mentioned a bit earlier, you become an independent achiever. And this is really a critical stepping stone for professionals. You've got to, hopefully you're able to take a stand for what you believe is the best thing to do, or the ethics associated with a choice that you're faced with. So we call these forced choice ethical dilemmas, where some of the things that you can encounter in your professional practice, one way or the other, it might look very appealing to go in a certain direction, but they have costs associated with it. And sometimes, young professionals believe, well, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But as you mature in your professional practice, you begin to have confidence that you can make those tough choices and defend, the reasons why. So you acquire this inner compass. So Lear and Delightful and JJ, we really work hard to help people understand the importance of this inner compass, so you can self-navigate, when you're dealing with complex challenges that have no easy solutions or answers. And at this high level, you can see this transdisciplinary collaborator kind of way of thinking about things. You appreciate systems, you understand the importance of, how things are interconnected. You know that when you make a decision, it can ripple and have effects way beyond what we call second and third order effects, way beyond what you could imagine up front. And you have a way to understand that the decisions you make as a professional, they certainly require high levels of competence, with your cognitive abilities, but also high levels of competence with moral and ethical reasoning. Because at a very high level of professional practice, we have commitments to the common good. And so one of the key things about this particular high level of your growth is you have a kind of a characteristics of what Bob Sternberg talks about as wisdom. And in this wisdom, if you're looking for this kind of high level of professionalism, there's an element of humility. So Lear, has people go through these character strength assessments, and you get a chance to really look at, how strong are you in your ability to tolerate different diverse perspectives and consider, and value experiences that others can bring to the situation that you're facing. So yeah, you want to talk about that a little bit? Okay. The other thing I wanted to share.
Oh, sorry, Andy, my microphone was all sluggish.
Okay.
What I was saying was, and saying stuff with such great confidence. Our research builds on character strengths, and if any of you are new to that, there's a wonderful character strength survey. So I do recommend that you take it. And every September we have Character Day, where the world steps up and thinks about their strengths, how you organize your life, how you work with others, your passions, the things that drive you, your inner fire. And all of these elements come together. And when you take that survey, save the PDF from it. And Barbara, if you have a link to the survey, and if you don't worry about it. But in it, what I love about it is it tells you your top 5 strengths, which are your character strengths. And then you have the 24 strengths that are all part of your power skills. And what's interesting about the top 5 is mine was teamwork. And I was so shocked because I was the person on teams in school who would run roughshod over the entire team, right? I had to get the A, I had to be perfect. And now what's interesting is it's absolutely right. We are members of a team that works so cohesively. And so we meet every Sunday, we volunteer to do this, and we create these simulations But we also spend time in these salon meetings thinking about why do we do what we do, and why is the profession of arms important to us for understanding our competence and growth.
Thank you. Now, in the lower right hand of the visual that's on display, you'll see what we call the Thayer method. And the Thayer method has a really rich history at the service academies and Harvard. But it's basically this notion that in order to reach these higher levels of growth, you've got to create these tipping points. And the best ways to help people when they're ready for these tipping points in their next stage of development is to be presented with challenges where things are not so obvious and you're stretched beyond your immediate capabilities. And so Thayer in the early 1900s felt like, he was way ahead of his time, by the way, but he felt like the best ways to help people grow is to create these really engaging scenarios. And he did it, in real life kinds of challenges and puzzles. But we do it with simulations, and we create these really, kind of fun journeys. I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, so we can sort of talk about how we get at this. I'll briefly say a couple words. I'm going to turn this over to Lear here because this is her wonderful gift in the work. But one of the things that we really believe from the research, and we've been practicing this for several years, is this notion of the hero's journey, where you're presented with a really fascinating challenge, and you're presented with a story that has elements of mystery, and you've got to go on this like odyssey, and you discover many things on this journey about yourself, about others, and about the context of what you're learning as a professional in your practice. And I'm going to turn this over back to Lear because she has brought wonderful gifts to our work with her stories and her narratives and engaging people. And also JJ has done this as well.
Hey, thank you, Andy. And what Andy is referring to, and that's Spinoza, by the way, is that JJ is our science fiction librarian, and he pulls together all of this rich literature that helps to feed our realistic space simulations, but also give us an objective, a goal, the imagination, sparking so much within us. Now, I'm a storyteller. I attend writing conferences, and you know me, everything has to connect, right? So the hero's journey is this call to adventure, right? And this, if you thought about the Lord of the Rings, that's one way of illustrating it, or the Wizard of Oz, right? Where you get this call to adventure, you refuse the call, and then you're sucked into this amazing experience that, of course, is surprising to you. You don't know what you're doing. You're in a virtual environment that looks so strange and so foreign. When you first start walking through it, you think, well, it's just art craft, isn't it? There's these cool mesh, and there's these cool space builds, and there's this cool stuff. But what are we doing here? And why are we here? Okay, so the images in the lower right represent the Shackleton, or some of the other parts of our pilgrims build here. Let's see. Let me make sure. Okay, so speaking of challenges, as you go through the hero's journey, as you go around this circle, of course, you're meeting with a mentor, right? You're getting information, and that's the Red Queen, the AI augmented mindset that we have inside the system. And we're going to show you images of it here in just a moment. And of course, as we think about the challenges that people face, they're walking through various parts of the simulation, interacting with objects, trying to discover, why am I here? What am I doing? Where am I going? And how will I advance through this, right? Adding meaning to the challenge. So then we have this going through the pathway and navigating, overcoming obstacles. All of a sudden, you might not be breathing so well, right? Because let's face it, life on Mars, one of our unsolvable problems right now, the art of the impossible, if you will, is the fact that you can't breathe there. So while we have this quest for Mars, we recognize that it's not a hospitable place. I'm going to pause here on the slides and turn it back over to Andy. There you go, Andy.
You go to the next one for me. Thank you, Lara. This is a busy slide, but let me just talk to it briefly. This is the pathway structures the Lara was talking about with our AI system. We have a neural net-based AI that we got from MIT that's used in the simulation. And the pathway is based on research on ethical decision making and moral dilemmas. People like Paul Moore and Ann Gordon at Bowling Green and others around the country, Bob Shannon. They've been researching, this really interesting kinds of ways that as we're dealing with ethical dilemmas in our professional practice, it requires a shift of our mindsets, sort of like a Carol Dwight notion that we have to be able to recognize the situation that we're in and, take ourselves out of the automaticity level of how we quickly make decisions and become much more reflective. And this is really, really important when you're dealing with complexity compared to something that's complicated. And I just want to briefly share that the difference between something being complicated and complex is complicated can be very, very hard, but there's usually a pretty correct solution to what you're facing. It could take you a very long time to get there. And if you ask other people what would be a good solution, they could come ultimately to a pretty good consensus about that. Whereas when something is complex, there is no textbook solution. There is no common agreement about next steps to take. And this is at the highest level of the challenges that you can face as a professional, because people are more likely looking to you to act, and to act with all the background experience you can bring to the challenge. So when you work through the tough choices, it's really helpful to have something like a simulation where you can actually try out, okay, how do you actually, engage in finding out the information you need to get when you don't know the solution because you haven't been taught it, or you're dealing with something that is very new to you. You've never seen a particular problem that you're encountering before. We try to create those kinds of challenges in our simulation. And so you can actually go through simulation, and at different times, you're going to be facing a complicated problem and a complex problem. And what does it look like and feel like as you're working those kinds of problems in your professional work? Next one, please. Thank you. Now, there's architecture behind all this. Hopefully, these slides will come into focus. But the architecture is makes use of common platforms. We take advantage of a virtual platform, and we use cloud computing. And the neural net works off of a cloud machine, and it sends data back and forth to the simulation on the virtual platform. And we have an ontology that helps us with parsing semantic structure or constructs. When people interact with these Red Queen interfaces in the simulation game, it gives feedback based on language input into the game. And so using these models that are part of the structure of the simulation, we can get really good at figuring out over time what people are grasping as far as we're wanting them to help understand as they're working through the simulation in those areas that they could focus in on. So this is very, very exciting work for us. We keep a lot of data that we use to examine how well the environment is helping people. And I'm going to go to the next slide and kind of highlight a few of the interfaces with this work. We have over time, experiment with different interfaces to make this architecture, uh, fairly transparent to participants in the simulation, and make it fun to interact with these kinds of capabilities. So we have different kiosks and interfaces. We've even experimented with using the Echo device, the Alexa pieces of it. We have Unity game engine interfaces, and we use the Unity engine in the simulation for supporting a network of communications with players as well as AI social agents that send information or clues that people use to figure out parts of the challenge they're facing. So this, some of you that are maybe into the technology pieces or coding, but one of the things that we use that's fairly recent is this Lambda service. And that gives us a lot of power, because with Lambda, we only execute code as is called upon. So this gives us a lot more capability than worrying about having to always have things, compiled, sitting there on the back-end server, waiting to be used. We use it dynamically, which gives us, greater fluidity as people are going through this. And I'm not sure if you want to talk, but we do have up here the stages through the gameplay levels. That's awesome.
Sure. Well, what we mean by the gameplay levels is you start on Earth, right? And you're in a flight deck, and we showed a few images from this on Thursday. The days fly together, right? And but so you take off in a rocket, right? And in the rocket, it's grown so sophisticated these days. We're actually flipping switches and turning knobs and getting into a flight state before you ever take off. And of course, we're doing all of this because we're thinking about what is the complicated set of challenges it takes to fly a rocket, right? So we're not just getting in, right-clicking, sitting down, and then just in a cheesy fashion taking off anymore. Nowadays, you actually have a set of written procedures that will guide you through what is it like to be an astronaut? What is it like to have to make decisions about where you're going and how to get there? And I know that sounds interesting. We keep thinking we might want to do something for Space Camp one day, because so we're injecting more and more realism into this complicated set of challenges. And the 7 levels and the 7 kiosks refers to as you navigate through all these different spaces, from Earth to the rocket to the space station, and from the space station to the Mars Red Lion Deep Space Explorer, and then over to Mars Colony, right, the space station. And then as you go down through the levels, and you're exploring and discovering and trying to figure out, what does this stuff mean, and what kinds of answers am I getting, and is there any equipment that might help me in my quest? Well, the Red Queen's there, these kiosks, and you see it right there in the bottom center. And you, of course, interact with it. You ask it questions, and in a couple slides, you're going to see some of the responses you might get from it. Now, Dave Miami says, I would love to know how you do the back-end integration of the database with Unity, Andy.
Yes, we use a distributed database architecture, and it feeds all the platforms. We use API calls into the databases, so that gives us tremendous flexibility with shared data. You go to the next slide here. Now, one of the things that we did a few years ago was we integrated our work with OpenEdX, and this is, some of you know, this is an effort with MIT and Stanford and Harvard, and we've taken a flavor of this architecture and came up with our own learning management system that's highly modular and supports the integration across parts of our simulation for data exchange. And so when people come into the LMS, they get presented with the modules that support the background instruction behind the simulations. And so here you can see we've got we partition out two particular modules that relate to our work, and that is that we want to help instructional system designers across each of our institutions learn about how to create these kinds of learning simulations and environments to support professional growth. So we actually, share a lot about our design structures and how we assess learning in these environments and so forth. And oh, I'm sorry.
You're okay. It's just we only have 8 minutes, and we have 12 slides.
Okay,
so
good.
it's going to boogie along a little bit here.
Okay,
That's a pleasure.
I love it. I love it. And what you have here, very similar to Open edX, is when you come in as a participant in the simulation, you have a way to get a sense of progress. So each of the parts of the simulation are assignments, and you get completion certificates, and there's little types of tools to support your dialogue. So if you were using these simulations as part of the course, you'd have a facilitator or instructors that could interact, and we encourage that if you use these simulations to come in, as a small team or group with a facilitator, and that makes the experience very, very enjoyable. Next slide, Larry. So as you can see in this environment, you get a little introduction to the simulations, and then you go off and do that, and the data is provided in feedback reports and tracked and indicating how far you've gone through the simulation and so forth. I'm going to go to the next one quickly, Lear. Thank you. Earlier we talked about this ontology that the AI system uses, and here's a screen snapshot of the feedback given to a participant at one of the stations in the simulation. So as you're responding to a question that's presented to you as a participant, it's taking your response and parsing it up semantically. And based on the constructs of what you've provided in your response, it's going to give you some very specific feedback. And also, it's going to suggest resources for you to go to and learn more about the constructs maybe that were absent in your response. So this was just implemented, I want to say, about 6 months ago, so it's fairly new to our work. Next slide, please. So here is the back end to the neural net processing that's occurring in gameplay of the simulation. And what an instructor can do is go in and for each participant see the particular types of levels of how people have progressed through the simulation, and they get a sense of, a progress report of that participant. And so they can even award badges. So we've got a little badge system in the simulation, and based on the recommendations by the AI engine. So next one, please. So, for example, when you go in as an instructor, you can see the AI agent will give feedback. If they believe that the participant in the simulation is showing, growth expectancies associated with the characteristics that we were sharing at the beginning of our presentation, and it says at the end of the analysis whether a certain badge should be awarded. So, so it's a little bit of a fun thing we try to create for participants. They can, they can put the badges on their space outfits, and so it gives us a little sense of progress that people can have by showing it. Or JJ, you might want to talk about that too. Now I think we're gonna send to this.
I am, because you have like 4 minutes and then a little time for questions. So, and we have 24 slides for the audience, so just so you know.
So why don't you just walk through some of our screen snapshots? And,
sure.
That way you can keep the pace moving.
Absolutely. We're inside the Deep Space Explorer here, which just keeps changing. And if you recall, in 2010, we won the grand prize from the Federal Virtual World Challenge for the Mars expedition. So here you're seeing some of that spacecraft on the inside. We also think of this as a navigation and a cognitive tool for moving between the space station and Mars station itself. So, hey, thank you, Day. And by the way, we didn't get the money. It went to research, right? but it's the notion that it was a very great honor for them to create a prize that didn't exist. When we showed up, it was so funny because we're sitting there and Will Wright was in the audience. And I don't know if you know, does anyone know who Will Wright? Do you know who he is? Anyone? Of course, it's one of the reasons we're sitting here today. Let's face it. If he didn't do the early work in simulation design, what games is he famous for? Yep, that's one. Hey, James, it's good to see you. And of course, Sim City and Spore, and yeah, you'd think, right, Adobel? But he's transformational for us, because we wouldn't have virtual worlds, we wouldn't have all this early work if we hadn't thought about how important it is to simulate the experience, right? And then think about people and their socialization and even their hygiene, right? In his game, he thinks of a lot more than perhaps we're executing. And yes, he was with Maxis, and he has the Stupid Fun Club. And then, of course, as a result of us winning, Will Wright spoke to me and invited me to the Black Ops team. And Pookie Amsterdam, I don't know if she's in the audience, but she and I and others participated in creating a TV show called Bar Karma based on this. And this was just the notion of that connectivism, the hero's journey. And think of Bar Karma as the Twilight Zone meets the Men in Black. And if you could type that for me, the Twilight Zone meets the Men in Black, because it's the place you go when your karma catches up to you. It's this thought that when you do things in your life and then perhaps they're not so optimal, right? You step through a door, and next thing you know, you're in a trans-dimensional space. You're in a new space. You didn't go through the door you thought you were going through, and next thing you know, you're in the bar called Bar Karma, and you have to deal with your the results of your decisions. Well, I better keep an eye on the time, right? Oh, thank you, Evelyn. So outside the Red Lion Deep Space Explorer, you're seeing an image from our simulation here. So that's the spacecraft, and it keeps changing. It keeps evolving over time. Now, Andy, if you want to chime in, you just grab that microphone. Otherwise, I'm going to march with a vengeance here, right?
I love listening to your descriptions.
We have to realize I love play, and many of you know that's the reason I'm in virtual worlds. And by the way, I went very quickly over the space dock there, and certainly these images are all online, by the way. So if you need any of them, let me see if I still have the link. Nope. I'll get you the link for our slides, so you don't have to feel rushed at all. And then in poster exhibit 113, I have a copy of these slides and other things inside a little glowing ball that's on the second part of the platform. So I made it a quest to see if you guys could find my stuff, right? And if you find my stuff, you get all of the objects you see around you, except for the floating island, the spacesuit, and I think those are the only 2 things you don't get. So you get everything else, including the viewers and even the room, the universe that I created. Andy, I created a little universe so they could float around and think about what they're doing. Now here's sick bay. I better click my little things, right? So the space station and the space dock have grown up since the Mars expedition. And then we have landing on Mars. That just happened. And then now we're inside sick bay and Andy's having his physical. I love this next slide, by the way, Andy. You have some new imagery here on the screens of what a physician might see as you're going through this medical procedure. You want to tell us about that, Andy?
Well, what we're trying to do here is introduce a way to tie in. My background is also biomedical informatics, and so one of the things we're always trying to do is relate, the exploration to science and STEM areas. So as you interact out the simulation, you're going to get introduced to all kinds of really fun things to learn about, the application of the sciences. And in addition to science fiction, this would be a good time there just to highlight the importance that science fiction plays in our work as you progress through the expedition, and JJ's contribution to helping people understand the relationship between imagination and science.
Absolutely. And if anyone has any questions as we're going through this, because we're at the end of our time. So, by the way, Delightful says, question for Spinoza. Our educators may not be as familiar with the Thayer method that we illustrated on our earlier slide in the lower right corner. Can you elaborate on what it is and why it is important for becoming a great charioteer? And a charioteer, for those of you who joined us in progress, is this notion that one horse is going off in one direction, the other horse is going off in another direction. They're trying to pull these conflicting forces together into a cohesive experience. There you go, Andy.
Oh, yeah. As I shared when we were on that visual, Thayer was very instrumental in the early 1900s to come up with this approach for engaging his students with these really engaging learning activities that would encourage them to go beyond their current capabilities and stretch them. And so he called it shooting the azimuth. And so you kind of say, okay, here's where I'm currently at in my capabilities. Now, how do I move to that next level? And so he would encourage his students to actually think about, what does it take to keep growing? What responsibilities do I need to assume for my own development? And so over the years, the Thayer method is the actual pedagogy that the service academies employ in very creative ways. And also Harvard does the same thing, because they're wanting their students to acquire this lifelong skill set for being able to assess where they're at with their abilities and competencies and be able to navigate to higher levels of capabilities. So, yeah, so the Thayer method is very, very highly respected in those schools, and we employ it in our work because we really believe that people, can really benefit by having a way to navigate for their growth throughout their lifespan.
Well, thank you, Andy, and Delightful, and JJ, my wonderful team. And of course, we're at the end of our session here. It's an open simulator, Pausian. So that means that we use a form of this viewer we're using, the Firestorm viewer is what we're using, and we use the OpenSim version of it, so a second copy of it that allows us to log into Second Life and to Open Simulator. So we like to bridge worlds. We are the Harmony Society. We meet on Sundays. We're a collection of friends. We've been meeting over 12 years to work on these things. So it didn't happen overnight. It happens with all this thought behind it. I'd like to thank our conference organizers and to our wonderful team, because I see we're at the end of our time. But Pausian, the way you would connect with us is you'd log in either to our grid or to any OpenSim account, and then we would give you hypergrid access to use a URL to come visit us.